The treaty, China still refuses to recognize 160 years later. What if I told you that modern China's entire foreign policy, its territorial claims, its relationship with the West, and even its military buildup all stem from a single treaty signed 160 years ago that China still refuses to recognize as legitimate? Because while Western historians call it the Treaty of Aigun, or the Treaty of Beijing, or just historical border agreements, China calls it something completely different. They call it part of the unequal treaties forced on China during the century of humiliation. And they've never, not for a single day in the past 160 years, accepted these treaties as valid. This matters right now, today, because the land China lost in those treaties, it's currently part of Russia, about 600,000 square miles of it. That's larger than Alaska, and China has never forgotten it. Let's talk about the treaty that changed everything. The treaty that broke China. It's 1858. China is in the middle of the Second Opium War. British and French forces have occupied Canton. They're marching toward Beijing. The Qing dynasty is collapsing from internal rebellions and external invasions. And Russia, supposedly China's northern neighbor and potential ally, sees an opportunity. Russian diplomat Nikolai Muravyov arrives in Aigun, a city on the Amur River with 40 warships and thousands of troops. He's not there to help China. He's there to take advantage of China's weakness. On May 28, 1858, under the implicit threat of Russian military force while China is fighting the British and French in the south, Qing dynasty official Yishan signs the Treaty of Aigun. With one signature, China loses all territory north of the Amur River to Russia. That's about 231,000 square miles. Gone. But Russia isn't done. 2 years later, in 1860, while British and French forces are literally burning down the old summer palace in Beijing, Russia offers to mediate the conflict. Their price for mediation? The Treaty of Beijing. This treaty gives Russia everything east of the Ussuri River, including the crucial coastal region where Vladivostok sits today. Another 133,000 square miles. Gone. Then in 1864, while China is still reeling, Russia forces the Treaty of Tarbagatai, taking control of disputed territories in Central Asia. Another 200,000 plus square miles. Gone. In less than a decade, China lost over 600,000 square miles of territory to Russia. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the size of Mexico. Imagine Mexico just disappearing from the map in 6 years. And here's the critical part that shapes everything that happened afterward. China never agreed this was legitimate. They signed under duress. They signed while being invaded by other powers. They signed because they had no choice. But they never accepted it. The Unequal Treaties Doctrine. The Chinese term for these agreements is Buping Deng Tiao Yue, unequal treaties, and it's not just about the Russian land grabs. Between 1842 and 1943, China was forced to sign dozens of treaties that extracted concessions, opened ports, ceded territory, and limited Chinese sovereignty. The Treaty of Nanking after the First Opium War, the Treaty of Tientsin, the Boxer Protocol, treaty after treaty imposed by military force, stripping away Chinese autonomy piece by piece. From the Chinese perspective, these weren't legitimate diplomatic agreements. These were instruments of colonial subjugation, and under international law, treaties signed under coercion are considered invalid. The legal principle is clear. Coercion vitiates consent. If you sign a contract with a gun to your head, that contract isn't binding. China applies the same logic to the unequal treaties. Western powers argue that historical treaties, even if unfair, establish recognized borders. You can't just retroactively invalidate agreements signed over a century ago because modern sensibilities have changed. China's position is different. These treaties were never valid in the first place. They were imposed by force during China's moment of maximum weakness, and weakness doesn't create legitimacy. This isn't just historical grievance. This is active foreign policy doctrine. what China actually lost. Let's be specific about what those Russian treaties took from China, because the details matter. The Amur River region was home to significant Chinese populations. Cities like Haishanwei had been Chinese fishing and trading posts for centuries. The region was rich in resources strategically valuable and culturally Chinese. After the treaties, Russia renamed Haishanwei to Vladivostok, which literally means ruler of the East in Russian. Think about that name. Russia wasn't just taking territory, they were declaring dominance over the entire Eastern Pacific. Today, Vladivostok is Russia's largest Pacific port. It's the eastern terminus of the Trans-Siberian Railway. It's home to Russia's Pacific Fleet. It's strategically critical to Russian power projection in Asia. And China remembers that it used to be theirs. The land itself is incredibly valuable. The Russian Far East contains massive oil and natural gas reserves, critical mineral deposits including rare earths, vast forests with timber resources, productive agricultural land, access to the Pacific Ocean with ice-free ports, strategic position controlling sea routes. But beyond material value, there's something deeper, something that connects to the tributary system and the concept of Tianxia, all under heaven. For 2,000 years, Chinese emperors claimed authority over all lands that recognized Chinese cultural superiority. The northern territories were part of that system. Tribes and kingdoms in Manchuria, Mongolia, and Siberia sent tribute to Beijing. The Russian treaties didn't just take land, they severed the conceptual geography of Chinese civilization. They broke all under heaven into pieces. The Putin factor. Vladimir Putin's Russia presents China with both opportunity and complication. On one hand, Russia, under Western sanctions, needs China more than ever. They need Chinese markets for their resources. They need Chinese manufactured goods. They need Chinese political support in international forums. This dependency gives China leverage, not leverage they're using aggressively right now, but leverage that exists and grows stronger every year. On the other hand, Putin is acutely aware of Russian nationalism and the anxiety about Chinese influence in the Far East. He can't appear weak on territorial issues. He can't let China dictate terms. So we have this fascinating dance where China invests heavily in Russian territory that they privately believe was stolen from them, while Russia accepts that investment out of economic necessity while maintaining the fiction of absolute sovereignty. Neither side says the quiet part out loud, but both sides understand the underlying reality. If Russia ever weakens significantly through economic collapse, political fragmentation, or military defeat, China will be positioned to reclaim influence over territories they've never stopped considering rightfully theirs. What this means for global power. The treaty issue matters far beyond China-Russia relations. It reveals something fundamental about how China thinks about international order. Western international law is based on the sanctity of treaties, even historical ones. Borders are settled, agreements are binding, the past is past. China's position is that international law created by Western powers during the colonial era isn't neutral or just. It's a system designed to legitimize Western conquests and prevent colonized nations from recovering. From China's perspective, why should they accept as permanent the territorial arrangements imposed when they were weak? Why is the border drawn by Russian guns in 1858 more legitimate than the border that existed for centuries before? This isn't just about land, it's about who writes the rules of international order. China's refusal to recognize the unequal treaties as legitimate is a refusal to accept that Western-dominated international law is the final word on these questions. And as China becomes more powerful, as their economy grows, as their military modernizes, as their geopolitical influence expands, they're increasingly in a position to challenge that system. Not through military conquest, that would be counterproductive and dangerous, but through economic integration, demographic shifts, legal reinterpretation, and patient strategic positioning. The gunpowder lesson applied. Remember what we learned about gunpowder? China invented world-changing technology but lost the global power competition because they didn't maintain strategic advantage. Modern China will not make that mistake with territory and sovereignty. They're not aggressively demanding the return of the Russian Far East. That would be foolish and premature. Russia still has nuclear weapons. Russia is still a military power. An aggressive approach would unite Western powers and Russia against China. Instead, China is doing what they do best, playing the long game. They're investing in the territories economically. They're building dependencies. They're establishing presence. They're waiting for demographic and economic realities to create facts on the ground that eventually supersede old treaties. And crucially, they're maintaining their legal and historical position that those treaties were never legitimate in the first place. This gives them flexibility for the future. If circumstances change, if Russia weakens, if opportunities arise, China hasn't foreclosed the option of raising the territorial issue again. The 2100 map. Here's a thought experiment that Chinese strategists are definitely running. It's the year 2100. What does the map look like? Russia's population has declined from 145 million to perhaps 100 million, with most living west of the Urals. The Russian Far East has become economically integrated with China. Chinese companies own most infrastructure. Chinese citizens outnumber Russians in many areas. Climate change has made northern territories more valuable and accessible. Resources that were locked in permafrost are now extractable. Sea routes through the Arctic are open. China's economy is the world's largest. Their military is the most advanced. Their political system has proven durable. They're the dominant power in Asia. Under those circumstances, does the 2004 border agreement still hold? Does Russia have the power to resist Chinese pressure for renegotiation? Does international opinion support Russian control of territories that are economically and demographically Chinese, even if they're nominally Russian? This is speculative. Maybe none of it happens. Maybe Russia rebounds. Maybe Chinese expansion stalls. Maybe nuclear weapons make territorial conquest permanently obsolete. But the point is, China has positioned itself to take advantage if circumstances shift. They've never surrendered their historical claim. They've never recognized those treaties as legitimate. They've just agreed not to fight about it right now. The century of humiliation never ended. In Chinese political consciousness, the century of humiliation began with the First Opium War in 1839 and supposedly ended with the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. But here's the thing, those unequal treaties are still in effect. The territories are still gone. The borders imposed by foreign powers during China's weakness are still the actual borders. From that perspective, the century of humiliation hasn't truly ended. It won't end until China has recovered what was taken during that period. This doesn't necessarily mean military reconquest. It could mean economic dominance, demographic predominance, political influence, creating situations where formal sovereignty becomes meaningless because real power lies with China. When Xi Jinping talks about national rejuvenation and the Chinese dream, he's explicitly connecting to this narrative. The dream isn't just about economic development or military strength. It's about recovering from the historical humiliation of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And a key part of that recovery is addressing the territories lost through the unequal treaties. Why this matters now. You might be wondering why we should care about 160-year-old treaties and historical grievances. Here's why it matters. Russia is currently isolated by Western sanctions over Ukraine. They're economically dependent on China. They need Chinese support desperately. This gives China leverage they've never had before in the relationship. And while they're not using that leverage aggressively now, the balance of power is shifting. Chinese investments in the Russian Far East are accelerating. Chinese influence is growing. Chinese economic integration is deepening. At the same time, Russia's population crisis is worsening. Their economy is struggling. Their military has been weakened by the Ukraine war. Their geopolitical position has never been more dependent on Chinese goodwill. These are exactly the conditions under which historical territorial questions can resurface. China doesn't need to make aggressive demands. They can simply wait while realities on the ground shift in their favor. And when the time is right, when the balance of power has shifted enough, they can begin asking questions. Not "give us back our territory immediately," but softer questions. Should we renegotiate resource extraction rights? Should we establish special economic zones with greater Chinese administrative control? Should we recognize the demographic realities with new governance structures? Death by 1,000 cuts, each small shift creating new facts on the ground, each concession setting precedent for the next one, and it all goes back to a treaty signed in 1858 that China has never, not for one single day, recognized as legitimate. The bottom line: the Treaty of Aigun and the other unequal treaties aren't ancient history. They're active elements of Chinese foreign policy calculation. China's official position has never wavered. These treaties were imposed by force during a period of national humiliation, and they lack moral and legal legitimacy. But China is patient. They don't need to overturn these treaties today. They can wait for circumstances to change. They can invest, build, integrate, and position themselves so that when opportunities arise, they're ready. The refusal to recognize these treaties isn't about the past, it's about the future. It's about maintaining claims that might be useful in 20 years or 50 years or 100 years. It's about never foreclosing options. It's about remembering that borders drawn by foreign powers during China's moment of maximum weakness don't have to be permanent. This is the long game. This is strategic patience. This is how a civilization that thinks in millennia operates in a world where other powers think in election cycles. 160 years later, China still refuses to recognize the Treaty of Aigun, not because they're being stubborn, not because they can't let go of the past, but because they're preparing for a future where the map of Asia might look very different than it does today. And unlike with gunpowder, unlike with the tributary system's collapse, unlike with the century of humiliation, this time China is making sure they're in a position to write the ending to the story. That treaty from 1858, China's not fighting about it today, but they've never accepted it. They've never stopped considering those territories as rightfully theirs, and they're positioning themselves so that future generations of Chinese leaders will have options that current leaders don't. That's why they refuse to recognize it. That's why it still matters. And that's why you should be paying attention. Click on the video on your screen now to keep watching. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and see you in the next one.